My name is David Luke. For the last 2 years, I have been the sole keeper of the Beacon Point Light. It's a posting few people want in this modern age, a lonely granite tooth 12 miles out from a coastline that has mostly forgotten it exists. The Coast Guard maintains it remotely for the most part, but the lens mechanism is a magnificent, cantankerous old beast of brass and cut glass, a relic that requires a human touch. That touch is mine. I chose this life, or rather, I drifted into it. After a decade in the Navy as a systems technician, the silent, ordered solitude of the Lighthouse felt less like a job and more like a decompression chamber for the soul. The tower stands on a jagged knuckle of rock barely an acre wide, connected by a long, crumbling causeway to a slightly larger island that houses my quarters, a generator shed, and a small, sturdy boathouse. On a clear day, I can just make out the smudge of the mainland, a reminder of a world that operates on different principles. Here, my world is governed by the tide, the weather, and the rhythmic, sweeping pulse of the light. My days are a metronome of maintenance checks, polishing the colossal Fresnel lens until it glints like a captured star, logging weather data, and reading thick paperback novels whose spines have been softened by a dozen previous keepers. I loved it. I truly did. The isolation was a balm. The roar of the sea was a constant, soothing companion. I was competent, self-reliant, and entirely alone. It was everything I thought I wanted. I look back on those early months now and see a man so blissfully, dangerously unaware of the true nature of his post. He believed the only monsters were in the sea's dark depths and in the frailties of his own mind. He had no idea that the real monster was the place itself. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a localized weather phenomenon, an oddity of the microclimate created by the Gulf Stream curling around this specific shoal. It was a full moon in August, the sky, a canopy of hard, bright stars with no hint of cloud. Yet, creeping from the north, a bank of fog advanced upon my island. It was unnaturally thick and low to the water, a rolling, silent tide of vapor. I checked the radar array in the control room. Nothing. The screen showed clear skies for 100 miles in every direction. I called the mainland station, a routine check. The watch officer, a young petty officer named Costello, confirmed my readings. "Clear as a bell out here, David," he'd said, his voice crackling slightly over the radio. "Not a whisper of fog on any satellite. You sure your gear is calibrated?" "Calibrated it yesterday, Costello. It's strange. It's like it's being generated right on the water. It's already swallowing the northern shoals." "Well, keep an eye on it. Weird things happen out there. Sea smoke, maybe?" "Too warm for sea smoke," I replied, but I let it drop. He was on the land, in a brightly lit room, surrounded by others. I was here, watching a phantom fog bank devour the ocean. It rolled in and blanketed everything. The world beyond the lantern room glass became a formless, glowing swirl of white. The powerful beam of the light didn't penetrate it so much as illuminate it from within, turning the fog into a pulsating, luminous entity. The air grew cold, damp, smelling of salt and something else. Something old, like water drawn from a deep, forgotten well. And then, I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was the radio. A crossed signal, maybe a fishing boat transmitting on a nearby frequency. I went to the console, fiddling with the dials, but all I got was static. The voices, however, persisted. They weren't coming from the speaker, they were coming from outside, from within the fog. They were faint, conversational, a man and a woman. Their words were indistinct, snippets of dialogue lost to the low moan of the foghorn I had just activated. I remember pressing my ear to the cold glass of the lantern room, straining to listen. It sounded like an argument, or perhaps a tense discussion. I caught a name, Eleanor. It was spoken with a tone of pleading. Then the foghorn blared again, drowning it out. I stayed up there for hours, listening. The voices would rise and fall, a ghostly cocktail party hosted by the sea. I told myself it was an acoustic illusion, the sound of the waves and the horn playing tricks on a lonely mind. When the sun rose, the fog was gone. It didn't burn off. It simply retreated, pulling back into the sea as if it had never been. The next morning, doing my routine inspection of the island's perimeter, I found it. Lying on the dark, wet rocks of the causeway was a small, silver locket, tarnished and crusted with salt. It was heart-shaped. I pried it open with my thumbnail. Inside, the tiny portrait of a smiling woman with dark, bobbed hair was protected by a disc of yellowed celluloid. It was old. From the 40s, maybe. I logged it as found property, assuming it had been washed up by the tide, a tragic piece of flotsam from some long-forgotten loss. I put it in a box with other oddments the sea had given me over the months. A weathered buoy, a glass float, a ship's broken nameplate that read, Dia. The locket felt different, though. Colder. More personal. A month later, the full moon returned, and with it, the fog. This time I was ready. I stood in the lantern room, my logbook open, a digital recorder in my hand. The fog rolled in with the same unnatural silence, the same radar invisibility, and the voices began. This time they were clearer, more numerous. It was a cacophony of conversations, overlapping and weaving through the sound of the horn. I could distinguish dozens of different people speaking, a child crying for its mother, two men arguing about a card game, a woman humming a lullaby. I started the recorder, holding it close to the glass. I strained to pick out names, call signs, anything that could give me a clue. I heard, "Get the pumps working, for God's sake, O'Malley," shouted in a panicked Irish brogue. I heard a quiet, resigned voice say, "Tell Margaret I love her. The ship it's breaking up." I heard a name repeated, Ariadne. The same name as the partial plate I'd found. My blood ran cold. These were not cross signals. These were last words. The fog lingered until just before dawn. When it receded, I went outside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rocks were littered with them. A man's gold wedding band, inscribed, "To H from E, forever yours 1948. A single, salt-stained leather boot, small enough for a child. A sodden, black and white photograph of a young family posing stiffly in front of an old automobile, the paper warped but the images hauntingly clear. And near the base of the tower, lying on a bed of seaweed, was a navigator's compass, its brass casing green with age, the needle still pointing resolutely north. That was when the curiosity curdled into something much darker. This wasn't a collection of random sea-tossed debris. These items corresponded to the voices, to the shipwrecks. I spent the next month in a fever of research. I cross-referenced maritime disaster archives with the names and phrases I'd managed to record. O'Malley was a stoker on the SS Morro Castle, which burned off the coast of New Jersey in 1934, but records showed a handful of its lifeboats had drifted south. The Ariadne was a coastal freighter that went down in a hurricane in 1953 with all hands. All of them. The locket with the woman named Eleanor? It took me weeks, but I finally found it. A newspaper article from 1949 about a couple lost at sea during their honeymoon. Their yacht, the Sea Lark, was found capsized. His name was Henry. Her name was Eleanor. To H from E. My hands were shaking as I read it. These weren't echoes. They were testaments. The fog was a repository, a library of drowning souls, and it was leaving its card catalog on my doorstep. I tried to rationalize it. Some kind of bizarre quantum entanglement, a temporal anomaly. I used all the language my technical mind could conjure to build a wall of logic around the terrifying truth. But the walls were flimsy, and the truth was a tide that was rising with every full moon. I didn't tell the Coast Guard everything. How could I? "Hello, Costello? The fog is here again, and it's talking to me." Also, it left a dead man's watch on my porch. I'd be relieved of duty for psychological reasons before I finished the sentence. I just reported the fog. Each time they had the same answer. "Nothing on our end, David. You're imagining things." The phrase began to feel less like a diagnosis and more like an accusation. My life, once a model of ordered routine, was now fractured into two distinct realities. There was the calm, sunlit world of maintenance, logs, and solitary meals. And then there was the waiting. The 28 days of dread that led up to the next full moon, to the arrival of the spectral fog and its chorus of the dead. I became obsessive, charting the moon phases, wind speeds, and tidal patterns, trying to find a scientific correlation that wasn't there. The only constant was the full moon. And then came October. The air was already sharp with the coming winter. The sea was a restless gray, kicking up a chop that sent spray halfway up the tower. I felt a deeper sense of foreboding this time, a cold knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. The fog arrived just after dusk, a solid wall of white that seemed to press against the lighthouse, muffling the world. The voices started, the usual tragic symphony. But then I heard a new one. It was a quiet voice, gentle and familiar, with a faint, wheezing quality I hadn't heard in 30 years. "Davy boy," it said. The sound was so clear, it was as if the speaker was standing right behind me. "Look at that light. Isn't it grand?" I froze. Every muscle in my body locked. Davy boy. Only one person in my entire life had ever called me that. I stumbled to the lantern room window, my breath fogging the glass. I wiped it away with a trembling hand and stared down at the causeway, now shrouded in the thick, glowing mist. For a moment, there was nothing but the swirl of vapor. Then, a figure resolved itself from the gloom. It was a man, elderly, wearing a simple cloth cap and a thick, dark wool coat. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking up at the sweeping beam of the light, a faint smile on his face. It was my grandfather. He had died of emphysema when I was 5 years old. I remembered that coat. I remembered that cap. I remembered that gentle, wheezing laugh. He took a few steps along the causeway, his form solid, real, casting a faint shadow in the luminous fog. He looked exactly as I remembered him, a memory pulled from the mind of a child and given flesh. He turned his head slowly, as if sensing my gaze, and his smile widened. He raised a hand, not in a wave, but as a simple gesture of acknowledgement. Then, as the beam of the light swept past him, he was gone. The fog swirled into the space where he had stood. I was left staring at nothing, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The other voices continued their mournful chorus, but I no longer heard them. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and that one impossible phrase, "Davy boy." The academic curiosity was gone, burned away by a terror so profound it felt like a physical blow. This was no longer about history, about maritime disasters and their unfortunate victims. The fog had reached into my own past. It had taken a memory, a beloved and deeply personal memory, and it had thrown it back at me. The entity in the mist wasn't just a collector of history. It was a predator of the heart, and it knew my name. The morning after I saw my grandfather, the world felt tilted on its axis. The sun rose, the fog was gone, but nothing was the same. The familiar comfort of my routine was shattered. Every task, from checking the diesel level in the generator to polishing the brass fittings in the lantern room, felt like the meaningless ritual of a condemned man. My solitude, once a source of strength, was now a cage. The silence between the howls of the wind was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with anticipation. I found nothing on the rocks that morning. No locket, no boot, no compass. This felt, somehow, more sinister than finding a pile of artifacts. The previous events had been about other people's tragedies. This one was mine. It needed no souvenir. The relic it left behind was inside my own head, a memory twisted into a threat. I couldn't sleep. When I did, my dreams were a swirl of gray fog and the faint, wheezing sound of my grandfather's breathing. I'd wake up shouting, my hands clutching the damp sheets, the phantom smell of salt and old wool in my nostrils. I had to talk to someone. The pretense of normalcy was a luxury I could no longer afford. I radioed the mainland and asked for my direct supervisor, Chief Warrant Officer Miller. Miller was a lifer, a man who had spent 30 years in the Coast Guard and had the weary, no-nonsense demeanor to prove it. He was fair, but he viewed the world through a thick lens of regulations and procedures. "David," he said, his voice stripped of warmth by the radio's tinny speaker. "Everything all right out there? Your last few reports have been a bit terse." "I need to talk to you about the fog, Chief," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've been over this, Luke. It's a localized atmospheric condition, unreported, sure, but not unheard of. Probably some kind of thermal inversion." "No, sir," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "It's more than that. I've been logging it. It only happens on the full moon. Exactly on the full moon. And there are auditory phenomena." There was a long pause. I could picture him in his office, leaning back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Auditory phenomena? David, are you feeling all right? The isolation can play tricks on you. I hear voices, sir. I pushed on, knowing how it must sound. Conversations, dozens of them, coming from the fog, and I'm finding things afterwards. Personal effects. Artifacts from old shipwrecks. I've identified some of them. The Ariadne, the Sea Lark. Whoa, slow down, son. Miller cut in, his tone shifting from professional to concerned. You're saying you're hearing ghosts, and they're leaving their luggage behind? The sarcasm was a shield, but beneath it, I heard the click of a mental health checklist being ticked. Last night, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, I saw my grandfather. He died 30 years ago. He was standing on the causeway. The silence that followed was absolute. For a full minute, the only sound was the hiss of static. When Miller finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, the kind of voice you use on a man standing on a ledge. David, listen to me. We're in the middle of a budget review, and I can't spare a relief crew right now. But how about you take some leave next month? Come ashore, decompress. We'll have Dr. Evans from the base medical staff have a chat with you. Just a formality. Dr. Evans, a psychiatrist. He thought I was losing my mind. The last thread connecting me to the sane, rational world had just snapped. I'm not crazy, Chief, I said, the words tasting like ash. I never said you were, he replied too quickly. You're in a high-stress, isolated environment. It happens. Just try to get some rest, Luke. Stay on top of your duties. We'll talk about this again next week. He cut the connection. I was alone, utterly and completely alone with my monster. His disbelief was a wall I couldn't breach, and it had the paradoxical effect of cementing my own sanity. I wasn't hallucinating. What I had seen was real, and if it was real, it could be understood. If it could be understood, it could be fought. My research took on a new, frantic urgency. I was no longer a curious archivist. I was a soldier, studying his enemy. I tore through the Lighthouse's official history, digitized records sent from the mainland archives, but the official stories were sterile, all dates and budgets and technical specifications. I needed the real story, the human story. I turned my attention to the keeper's quarters. This place had been continuously manned for over a century and a half. My predecessors must have seen it. They must have known. The modern furnishings were just a thin veneer over the old bones of the place. Behind a row of modern metal lockers in the supply closet, I noticed the wall seemed off. The wood paneling was a slightly different shade. Prying at the edge with my utility knife, I loosened a section. It came away to reveal a small, dark cavity in the thick stone wall. Inside was a metal box, rusted but intact. And inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. The ink on the first page was faded but legible. Elias Thorne, Keeper. Commencing duties, October 18, 1908. I devoured the journal over the next few days, my own duties barely attended to. Thorne was a methodical man, his early entries much like my own. Weather observations, maintenance notes, complaints about the supply boat being late. But then, about 6 months into his tenure, the tone changed. April 14, 1909. A full moon and a queer mist has come upon us. It does not show on the barometer, nor does it feel like a natural sea fog. It carries a chill that sinks deep into the bones. From the lantern room, I swear I can hear voices within it, like whispers from a distant crowd. My heart hammered as I read on. Thorne was describing the same phenomenon over a century ago. He called it the moon mist. His initial curiosity mirrored my own, quickly souring into fear. June 12, 1909. The mist came again with the moon. The voices were clearer this time. I heard a man cry the name Isabel. It is a cruel trick of the wind and water, I tell myself, but the telling does little to soothe the soul. August 10, 1909. Found a woman's silver comb on the rocks this morning after the mist receded. A beautiful thing, finely wrought. I have asked myself 100 times how it could have come to be there. There have been no wrecks hereabouts for years. Thorne's entries became more erratic. He wrote of seeing figures in the mist, shadowy forms that dissipated when the light beam passed over them. He wrote about the oppressive feeling of being watched. He mentioned other keepers, a man named O'Connell in the 1880s who was found drowned in the cistern, though there had been no rain for a month. A keeper from the 1860s who simply vanished from the island, leaving a half-eaten meal on his table. A pattern of madness, death, and disappearance, all linked to this isolated rock. Thorne theorized, just as I had, that the phenomena were linked to the tragedies in the surrounding waters, an area known as the Devil's Teeth for its treacherous shoals. But his theory went further. He didn't believe they were ghosts in the traditional sense. October 17, 1910. I no longer believe these are the restless spirits of the drowned. A spirit has a will, a purpose. These are but echoes, trapped in the water's memory. The mist is a vessel, a strange medium that gives these echoes voice and form. But what guides it? What intelligence gathers these final, desperate moments? It feels like a collection. Something is collecting these sorrows, hoarding them. For what purpose, I dare not imagine. A collector of sorrows. The phrase resonated with a terrible crystalline clarity. It explained the randomness of the voices, the jumble of different eras and disasters. The fog wasn't a haunting, it was a net, dragging the ocean floor for its psychic debris. And then came the entry that made me drop the book. November 15, 1911. It learns. Tonight, the mist brought a new terror. It did not merely replay the voices of the lost. It spoke with the voice of my brother, Thomas, who passed from consumption 2 years ago in Boston. It called my name from the shoreline. I know it is a trick, a damnable, cruel trick. It has somehow looked into my heart and found my deepest grief. I fear I have given it a weapon to use against me. My blood turned to ice. It had done the same thing to me with my grandfather. It wasn't just a passive collector. It was an active intelligence, a predator, and it fed on memory. It fed on love. The full moon was now only a week away. The dread that had been a low hum in my blood was now a screaming siren. I had a choice. I could pack my things, get on my boat, and flee to the mainland. I could let them lock me in a psychiatric ward. It would be safe there, sane, but Thorne's journal wasn't finished. On the last few pages, written in a shaky, desperate hand, was a set of rules. Rules for survival. Rule 1. Keep the light burning. The light is its cage. Its beam seems to disrupt the mist, to keep the forms within it from fully cohering. When the light falters, they grow bold. Rule 2. Never answer the voices, no matter who they claim to be. To answer is to give them purchase, to acknowledge their reality. Rule 3. Never step onto the rocks when the mist is present. It is its territory. The tower is a sanctuary, but the shore belongs to the mist. Rule 4. Guard your heart. Do not dwell on those you have lost or those you love. It can see your attachments. It will wear their faces. I had already broken the last rule. I had thought of my grandfather, and it had brought him to me. I thought of my ex-wife, Sarah, almost constantly, the ache of our separation, a dull, permanent fixture in my chest. Had it seen her face in my mind, too? The coming full moon was no longer just another event to be endured. It was a battle, and Thorne's journal was my only weapon. The man who wrote it had survived here for 7 years before finally requesting a transfer, citing failing health. The official record said he died in a Boston sanitarium a decade later. But he had survived the island. He had faced the collector, and he had escaped. He had left me a blueprint for survival. I wasn't going to run. I was the keeper of the light. And according to Thorne, that meant I was also the keeper of the cage. The days leading up to the November full moon were a blur of frenetic preparation. I was no longer just a lighthouse keeper. I was a soldier fortifying his position. I followed Elias Thorne's century-old advice as if it were scripture. I double and triple-checked the main generator, topping up its fuel and oil, cleaning the filters until they shone. I inspected the backup generator, ran it for a full hour to ensure it would kick in seamlessly if the main failed. The light was paramount. Thorne said it was the cage. I would make sure the bars were strong. I went through my personal effects, a strange and painful ritual. I took down the single photograph I kept of Sarah and me, taken on a beach in happier times. I couldn't risk looking at it, couldn't risk feeding the thing in the fog. I packed it away, along with a few letters from my mother, into the metal box with Thorne's journal, and sealed it back in the wall cavity. "Guard your heart," he'd written. I was attempting to do it literally, walling off my attachments in stone. The night of the full moon arrived with a vicious, unforecasted gale. The sea, which had been a restless gray, turned into a churning cauldron of black water and white foam. Wind shrieked around the tower, a physical presence that made the granite tremble. Rain came in horizontal sheets, lashing against the lantern room glass like handfuls of gravel. This was a real storm, a meteorological fury, and it was arriving in concert with the supernatural one. I called Miller at the Coast Guard station to log the weather, my voice tight. "The storm's hitting harder than they predicted, Chief. Winds gusting over 70 knots. "I see it on the satellite, David. It blew up out of nowhere. We have advisories out for all shipping. You sure you're okay out there? The evacuation offer still stands. We could try to get a chopper to you before it gets much worse." For a fleeting moment, I was tempted. The thought of the helicopter, of being lifted away from this rock and its horrors, was an almost overwhelming siren call. But Thorne's warning echoed in my mind. What would happen if I abandoned my post now, at the convergence of this storm and the moon mist? The light is its cage. If the keeper left, if the light failed during its moment of greatest power, a cold dread settled in my gut. This wasn't just about my survival anymore. "I'm fine, Chief," I lied, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "The tower has stood for over 150 years. It can take it. I'll ride it out." "All right, Luke, your call. Keep in contact." As dusk fell, it came. The moon was invisible behind the thick storm clouds, but its tidal pull, its cyclical power, was undeniable. The spectral fog didn't roll in this time. It seemed to rise from the waves themselves, a luminous, sickly white vapor that mingled with the dark sea spray, clinging to the tower. It was thicker, more substantial than ever before. The storm winds didn't disperse it, they only seemed to stir it, to whip it into a frenzy. The world outside the lantern room became a swirling vortex of white fog, black rain, and the angry sea. The foghorn's mournful bellow was almost lost in the shriek of the wind, and then the voices started. They were not the faint, distant whispers of before. They were a roar, 1,000 drowning souls crying out at once, their collective anguish, a sound that vibrated deep in my bones. Then, through the chaos, a single voice cut through, sharp and clear. "David." I froze, my hand on the lens rotation motor. It was Miller's voice, perfectly replicated. "David, your generator is failing. We're getting a weak signal from your beacon. You need to get out of the tower and switch to the auxiliary fuel tank now." I stared at the radio. It was silent, only the hiss of static. The voice had come from outside, from the storm. It knew about the auxiliary tank. It was using my professional knowledge, my sense of duty, against me. Never answer the voices. I turned my back on the window and focused on the steady, reassuring hum of the generator, which was, for now, running perfectly. "Don't be a fool, David," Miller's voice continued, closer now, as if he were just outside the door. "Follow procedure. The light is dimming." It was a lie. The beam was cutting its brilliant swath through the maelstrom, steady and strong. The entity was a poor technician, but it was a master psychologist. A new voice joined the assault. My mother's. "David, honey, I'm so worried. Please be careful." It was a perfect imitation of her anxious tone, the one she used when I was a child and had a fever. It was a sound engineered to pierce through any defense and strike directly at the heart. "Guard your heart." I squeezed my eyes shut, picturing the schematic for the generator, focusing on circuits and fuel lines, anything but the image of my mother's face. Then came the one I feared most. "David, can you hear me?" It was Sarah's voice. The sound of it, so unexpected and so painfully real, was like a physical blow. "I was so wrong. I miss you. Please, just open the door. I came for you." I stumbled to the window, against my better judgment. My mind screamed at me that it was impossible, a trick, but my heart was a traitor. I wiped the condensation from the glass and peered down at the narrow walkway that encircled the lantern room. A figure stood there, drenched and trembling, her back to the storm. It was Sarah. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face by the rain, her thin jacket no match for the gale. She looked exactly as she did in the photograph I had hidden away. She turned, and her face was a mask of pleading and fear. "David, please, it's so cold. Let me in." For a terrible second, I almost believed it. My hand went to the latch on the heavy iron door that led to the walkway. It would be so easy to open it, to pull her inside, to hold her again. But then I saw her eyes. In the sweeping pulse of the light, they looked wrong. There was no life in them, no recognition. They were flat, glassy, like the eyes of a doll. And behind the desperation in her voice, there was a cold, predatory patience. This thing was wearing my wife's face like a mask. Rage, cold and pure, surged through me, eclipsing the fear and the grief. It had taken my grandfather, my mother, and now Sarah. It had plundered my most sacred memories and turned them into weapons. I backed away from the door, my fist clenched. "You are not her," I whispered to the empty room. As if sensing its failure, the apparition of Sarah flickered and dissolved back into the churning fog. But the assault wasn't over. The entity changed tactics. It stopped using the voices of my loved ones and began to use the one voice I couldn't ignore. My own. "It's no use," my voice said, calm and rational, coming from the base of the tower. "The storm is too strong. The light is just making it angry. We should just let it go. It would be peaceful. They're all waiting for us. It's time to rest." This was the most insidious attack of all. It was using my own logic, my own exhaustion, turning my internal monologue into an external temptation. It was offering the one thing a tired, terrified man wanted most: an end to the struggle. That was when the main generator sputtered. The steady hum faltered, coughed once, twice, and then died. The lantern room was plunged into a terrifying, immediate darkness, the only light, the swirling, malevolent glow of the fog outside. The backup generator was supposed to kick in automatically, but after a few seconds of silence, I knew something was wrong. A red light flashed on the control panel. Fuel line blockage. The light is its cage. The cage was open. My training took over, a cold, mechanical calm settling over my panic. The backup generator had its own small reserve tank, but to fix the blockage I'd have to get to the main fuel pump, which was housed in the generator shed. The shed was a separate building, 50 yards away across the open, storm-lashed rock of the island. I would have to go outside. I would have to step into its territory. Never step onto the rocks when the mist is present. I had no choice. The alternative was to let the light die, and I couldn't do that. I didn't know what would happen, but Thorne's terror was clear enough in his writing. This thing could not be allowed to break free. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and my toolkit. I pulled on my oilskins, the thick, waterproof material, a flimsy armor against the supernatural storm. Taking a deep breath, I threw open the main door at the base of the tower and plunged into the chaos. The force of the wind almost knocked me off my feet. The air was a thick, blinding soup of rain and fog. The chorus of voices was deafening now, a wall of sound. Figures moved at the edge of my vision, dark, stooped shapes that scrambled over the rocks. They were clearer now, more solid, without the suppressing beam of the light. They were the drowned, the collected, the victims of the Ariadne and 100 other ships, their forms twisted by water and time. I kept my head down, the beam of my flashlight cutting a weak, wavering path in front of me. I focused on the ground, one foot in front of the other. Don't look at them. Don't listen to them. I was a technician with a job to do. That was all. A figure stumbled into my path. A sailor in an old-fashioned uniform, his face a bloated, featureless mask. "Help me," it gurgled, the voice a liquid rasp. I pushed past it, shoving it aside. The flesh felt cold and yielding, like wet clay. It fell without a sound. I reached the generator shed, my hands numb with cold as I fumbled with the padlock. I got the door open and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The sound of the storm was slightly muffled in here, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I could feel them, just outside the thin wooden walls, waiting. I worked with frantic speed, my flashlight clenched in my teeth. The fuel line was clogged with a thick, gelatinous substance that looked like algae, but felt wrong. I cleared the blockage, my fingers clumsy and slick with diesel. I primed the pump, then switched the fuel flow to the auxiliary tank. A green light on the panel flickered to life. From the main tower, I heard the blessed sound of the backup generator coughing to life. A second later, the great beam of the lighthouse slashed through the darkness once more. A collective, unearthly shriek rose from outside the shed, a sound of fury and pain. I had to get back. I took a breath, threw the door open, and ran. The light swept over the island in its steady, rhythmic pulse. In its brilliant glare, the figures on the rocks seemed to fade, becoming translucent, their forms dissolving like smoke. But in the moments of darkness between the sweeps, they were solid again, and they were moving towards me, faster now, their desperation palpable. I was halfway to the tower when a hand shot out from the rocks and clamped around my ankle. It was inhumanly strong and cold beyond belief, a cold that burned straight through my boot and into my bone. I fell hard, my flashlight skittering away into the darkness. I kicked out wildly, my heel connecting with something that cracked like dry wood. The grip loosened. I scrambled on my hands and knees, the rough stone tearing at my palms. The tower door was just feet away. A face loomed over me, that of the sailor I had pushed aside, its featureless head cocked to one side. It opened its mouth, and my own voice came out, full of despair. "It's too late, David. Just let the water take you." Then the light hit us. The beam swept across the scene, and the creature recoiled, its form dematerializing in the brilliant white glare. I used the moment to lunge for the door, throwing myself inside and slamming the heavy iron bolt home. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably, listening as the beam of light continued its relentless, protective sweep outside. With every pass of the light, the chorus of voices seemed to weaken, the shriek of the wind overpowering them, until finally, the only sounds were those of the storm. I don't know how long I stayed there, on the cold stone floor at the base of my tower. It could have been minutes or hours. The storm raged, the generator hummed, and the light turned, a tireless guardian against the dark. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, and the fog was gone. The sea was calm, the sky a clean, washed-out gray. It was over, for now. In the days that followed, a strange and profound quiet settled over me. The terror had receded, leaving behind a kind of crystalline understanding. I was no longer just David Luke, systems technician and lighthouse keeper. I was a warden, a sentry. This wasn't just my job, it was my post. When Miller radioed a few days later, his voice was full of relief and a newfound respect. "Luke, I don't know how you rode that one out. The mainland got battered." "You're a hell of a keeper." "Just doing my job, Chief," I replied, and for the first time, the words felt completely true. I didn't try to explain what had really happened. He wouldn't understand, and it no longer mattered. Some truths are not meant for the wider world. They belong to the places that birthed them. I retrieved Elias Thorne's journal from its hiding place. In the back, on the blank pages, I began to write my own account. I documented everything: the voices, the artifacts, my grandfather, the mimicry, the siege. I added my own rules, gleaned from my own battle. Rule 5. Trust your instruments, but trust your instincts more. It will use one to lie about the other. Rule 6. It can only use what you give it. Starve it of your memories. My testimony would be there for the next keeper, a link in a chain of vigilance stretching back through the lonely, haunted years. I am a different man now. The solitude I once craved is no longer a comfort, but a necessity of my duty. The fear has not vanished completely, but it has been forged into a kind of resolve. I maintain the light, I polish the lens, I watch the sea. I know what sleeps in the deep water around my tiny kingdom. I know the nature of the collector of sorrows that waits in the dark. There are times, on quiet, moonless nights, when I walk the causeway and look down at the waves. I think of the souls trapped in its collection, their last moments replayed for the benefit of a predator they can never comprehend. I am their only witness, their only memorial. I will never leave Beacon Point. My predecessor, Thorne, escaped with his life, but the experience broke him. I see now that leaving is not an escape. The only way to truly survive this place is to accept it, to become part of its secret history. I am the keeper of the light, the guardian of the cage, and I will not let the light go out. The full moon will come again next month. I will be ready.